Between his election and inauguration, President-elect Franklin Pierce was traveling by train with his family when the train derailed. This accident and its aftermath deeply affected Pierce, his wife, and his presidency. I'm Bob Summers, and this is a presidential story. In 1834, Congressman Franklin Pierce married Jane Appleton. Jane was well-read, very shy, and devoutly religious. In 1836, Jane gave birth to their first son, Franklin Pierce Jr. Sadness soon followed as Franklin Jr. died when he was 3 days old. After being elected to the Senate in 1837, the Pierce family grew with the birth of Frank Robert Pierce in 1839 and Benjamin Pierce in 1841. Jane absolutely hated living in Washington, D.C. She hated the weather, but worse than the weather were the congressional wives she was expected to spend time with. She considered the women ungodly, unladylike, and much too political. Jane spent much of her time in her boarding house rooms, only heading outside to attend church services. Eventually, she had had enough, so she stayed in Concord, New Hampshire with the children year-round. But even that wasn't enough. She wanted her husband with the family. Jane convinced Franklin to give up his Senate seat in 1842 after serving 5 years. Franklin promised his wife he was done with politics. The Pierces experienced grief once again when 4-year-old Frank Robert died of typhoid in 1843. As the sole remaining child, Benjamin, nicknamed Bennie, was the sole focus of his doting parents. Bennie, who had no memories of his older brothers, was a sweet child who was always trying to please his hovering mother. He was mostly homeschooled by Jane, who was well educated by her father, a minister, educator, and the president of Maine's Bowdoin College. Jane was happy. Her husband was home working as a lawyer, and Bennie was a healthy, kind, and smart child. It is said that Jane's greatest pleasure was listening to him recite his Bible lesson while she was sewing or knitting. But Franklin was restless. When the Mexican-American War broke out in 1846, Franklin saw an opportunity. He wrote to a friend seeking a commission, specifically noting, "Although I have not yet broached the subject with my wife, my purpose is fixed." Franklin did serve, was wounded, rose to the rank of brigadier general, and returned home a war hero. By 1852, the issue of slavery had split the country and the political parties. Despite assuring Jane that he had long been forgotten over the past 10 years, Franklin was quietly laying the groundwork for a resurgence. He maintained many active correspondence with his Democratic friends, telling them the only way the Democrats could win the nomination, much less the election of 1852, would be with a Northerner whose politics were acceptable to the South. After 48 ballots, the Democratic nominating convention was deadlocked. The Democrats finally settled on their compromise candidate on the 49th ballot, Franklin Pierce. Franklin was pleased. Jane was not. In fact, I can imagine Jane was not just unhappy, she was pissed off. But in a pious way. She was piously pissed off. She saw this as a form of vanity that was offensive to her creator. Apparently, Bennie didn't like it either. 11-year-old Bennie was said to have remarked to his mother, "I hope Papa loses. I don't want us to live in Washington. I know we shan't be happy there, will we, Mama?" Not only did Pierce win the 1852 election, it was a landslide. Pierce defeated his former commanding officer during the Mexican War, General Winfield Scott, 254 to 42. When Jane learned the result, she fainted. 2 months before the inauguration, the Pierces spent Christmas with Jane's sister, Mary, and her husband, John Aiken, in Andover, Massachusetts. On January 6, 1853, the Pierce family, Franklin, Jane, and Bennie, boarded the 1:15 train from Andover, Massachusetts to Concord, New Hampshire, where they would pack up their house to prepare for their move to Washington. Less than 3 miles into their trip, there came a violent jolt, followed by sudden wrenching and frightful jerking. The cold weather may have been a factor, as the train hit rocks on the tracks, breaking an axle. Several cars derailed. The sole passenger car rolled over an embankment onto a rocky field below. According to the New York Times, that car broke in pieces like a cigar box. Of the 60 passengers on the train, there was only one fatality. Unfortunately for the Pierces, that fatality was 11-year-old Bennie. Bennie was crushed and nearly decapitated. Franklin was unable to prevent Jane from seeing the gruesome sight that forever haunted them. Bennie's body was taken by cart back to the Aiken home, where his private funeral was later held. Jane was so grief-stricken she could not attend the funeral, nor could she accompany the casket back to Concord for burial. Jane also did not attend her husband's inauguration. All inaugural balls were canceled. It would be weeks before Jane arrived at the White House. Even then, she avoided social functions by remaining in the upstairs White House living quarters. Jane spent her time writing long letters to Bennie, apologizing for her failings as a mother, talking to him as if he were still alive, and holding seances. In order to help Jane, Varina Davis, the wife of Pierce's Secretary of War and future President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, performed many of the First Lady hosting duties. Jane assumed limited First Lady duties 2 years later, first appearing at a public New Year's Day reception wearing black. Jane wore black for the rest of her life. In fact, in the Smithsonian's First Lady's Gown collection, hers is the only black dress. Survivors who suffered injuries in the accident later sued the Boston and Maine Railroad, but Jane refused to join the lawsuit. She remained convinced their son's life had been sacrificed so Franklin would be free to focus on national duties and his vain political ambitions. She never forgave her husband for betraying the promise he'd made to her years before to stay out of politics. Franklin was racked with guilt. According to the Washington Post, Franklin refused to swear on the Bible during his inauguration because he was convinced God was punishing him for past sins by killing his son. The burden of guilt I carry for a public career that destroyed my family will haunt me for as long as I live. 9 years later, in 1862, another president lost an 11-year-old son when Willie Lincoln succumbed to typhoid. Franklin was the one man who knew what Abraham Lincoln was going through. He wrote to Lincoln expressing sympathy for the loss of the president's cherished boy who will nestle at your heart until you meet him in that new life, when tears and toils and conflict will be unknown.